The year was 1943, and Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Caldwell had just made the worst decision of his life. At 22,000 feet above the English Channel, with a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 locked onto his tail, every fiber of his being screamed one word: down. He pushed the stick forward. His P-47 Thunderbolt, all 7 tons of American steel and fury, responded instantly, plummeting toward the earth at nearly 500 miles per hour. The cockpit shook violently. The control stick began to stiffen in his hands. And then, something happened that defied everything his body told him was possible. The Messerschmitt behind him exploded. Not from his guns, not from anti-aircraft fire. The German fighter had simply disintegrated in mid-air, torn apart by invisible forces as it followed Caldwell into the dive. When Caldwell finally leveled out at 8,000 feet, drenched in sweat and trembling, he had no idea. He just witnessed the deadliest phenomenon in aerial combat, a killer that would claim more experienced pilots than enemy bullets ever would. The phenomenon had a name: compressibility, and before the war ended, it would kill hundreds of the best pilots in the world, turning their own aircraft into their executioners. September 1942, Edwards Air Force Base, California. Test pilot Captain Milburn Mel Apt sat in the cockpit of a brand new P-38 Lightning, preparing for what should have been a routine high-speed dive test. The P-38 was America's answer to German air superiority twin-engine twin-boom, capable of outrunning almost anything in the sky. The test was simple. Dive from 35,000 feet, accelerate to maximum speed, record the data, pull out. Apt never came back. What happened next was witnessed by ground crews through binoculars, and their testimonies would haunt military archives for decades. At approximately 30,000 feet, Apt's P-38 began to behave strangely. The nose started pitching downward more steeply, as if an invisible hand was pushing it toward the earth. Apt, they would later theorize, must have pulled back on the stick with everything he had. The stick didn't respond. At 25,000 feet, the aircraft was screaming downward at over 500 miles per hour faster than it was ever designed to fly. The wings began to flutter, then shake violently. Witnesses described it as watching the plane try to tear itself apart. At 15,000 feet, pieces began to separate from the aircraft. First the tail booms, then the wings, each component spinning away like leaves in a hurricane. At 8,000 feet, what remained of the P-38 with Captain Apt still inside smashed into the Mojave Desert at supersonic speed, creating a crater you could hide a house in. The official cause of death: loss of control during high-speed dive. But that wasn't the full truth. The full truth was far more terrifying. Captain Apt had discovered that there was a speed, a threshold beyond which the laws of physics that govern normal flight simply stopped working. He'd crossed the line into what pilots would come to call the compressibility zone, and once you entered it, your aircraft stopped being a machine you controlled. It became a coffin hurtling toward the earth, and no amount of strength, skill, or desperation could change your fate. By 1943, reports were flooding into Allied command from every theater of war. Pilots diving to escape enemy fighters weren't pulling out. Experienced aces attempting high-speed attack runs were auguring straight into the ground. Aircraft were breaking apart in midair with no enemy contact, no mechanical failure, no explanation. In the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander John "Blackjack" Davis, a decorated Navy pilot with 12 confirmed kills, died when his F-6F Hellcat disintegrated during a dive on a Japanese destroyer. The after-action report noted, aircraft appeared to accelerate beyond pilot's control. Witnesses observed wing failure at approximately 8,000 feet. In Europe, RAF Squadron leader Thomas Mitchell, survivor of the Battle of Britain, mentor to dozens of young pilots, died the same way in his Supermarine Spitfire. His last radio transmission, captured by his wingman, was 4 words that would be repeated in incident reports across the globe. "I can't. Pull out." The pattern was undeniable. The best pilots in the world, flying the most advanced aircraft ever built, were dying in droves, not from enemy action, but from something in the air itself. Something that turned speed from an advantage into a death sentence. Engineers scrambled to understand what was happening. Wind tunnel tests were conducted. Aircraft wreckage was analyzed, piece by piece. And slowly, horrifyingly, the truth emerged. When an aircraft approached the speed of sound, roughly 660 miles per hour at sea level, the air flowing over its wings stopped behaving like air. It started behaving like a solid wall. Shockwaves formed on the wing surfaces, destroying lift. Control surfaces became useless. The aircraft pitched nose down automatically, accelerating even faster, creating a death spiral that was aerodynamically impossible to escape. Pilots called it the dive of death. Engineers called it compressibility lock. The men who experienced it and somehow survived called it something else entirely. The hand of God pushing you toward hell. Here's what makes this story even more chilling. Military command knew. Classified documents declassified in the 1,980 seconds revealed that by mid-1943, Allied air forces understood the compressibility problem. They knew that diving beyond certain speeds in certain aircraft was almost certainly fatal. They knew that the P-38, the Spitfire, the P-47, and dozens of other frontline fighters had a maximum safe dive speed and that exceeding it meant death. But they didn't tell the pilots. Why? Because if pilots knew that diving the most instinctive defensive maneuver in aerial combat could kill them just as surely as enemy fire, it might make them hesitant, afraid. And in air combat, hesitation meant death anyway. So young men continued to climb into their cockpits, unaware that their own aircraft harbored a fatal flaw. They were told to avoid excessive dive speeds in vague briefings, but never told why, never told what would happen if they didn't. And they kept dying. Some estimates suggest that up to 15% of Allied aircraft losses in 1943 to 1944 were due to compressibility-related crashes, not enemy action. That's hundreds, possibly thousands of pilots killed not by the Germans or Japanese, but by a phenomenon their own commanders understood but chose not to fully explain. Lieutenant Jimmy Caldwell, the pilot we met at the beginning, was one of the lucky ones. He survived his dive that day over the English Channel because he was flying a P-47 Thunderbolt, one of the few Allied fighters robust enough to withstand the forces of compressibility, at least sometimes. But he watched 6 of his squadron mates die that same way over the next year. 6 friends, 6 funerals, 6 letters home explaining that their sons had died in training accidents or mechanical failures. The truth was classified. The deadliest move in the sky wasn't pulling the trigger, it was pulling the stick forward. December 1943, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. In a freezing hangar, surrounded by the wreckage of dozens of aircraft, a team of engineers stood before a chalkboard covered in equations that might as well have been written in blood. Each number, each calculation, represented another pilot who hadn't come home. Leading them was a 4-year-old aeronautical engineer named Richard Frost, a man who hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 6 months. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shook from too much coffee, and pinned to his jacket was a photograph of his younger brother, Captain Robert Frost, USAAF. Robert had died 3 months earlier. P-38 Lightning, high-speed dive over Tunis. The official report said mechanical failure. Richard knew better. "Gentlemen," Frost said, his voice hoarse, "we are asking our pilots to fight a war on 2 fronts. 1 against the enemy, and 1 against physics itself. And physics is winning." The room fell silent. What Frost and his team had discovered was even worse than they'd initially feared. It wasn't just that aircraft became uncontrollable at high speeds, it was that different aircraft had different death thresholds. And those thresholds varied with altitude, temperature, even humidity. A dive that was survivable at 20,000 feet could be fatal at 30,000. A speed that was safe in winter could kill you in summer. There was no universal rule. No simple answer. Every flight was Russian roulette. Nowhere was this more apparent than with the P-38 Lightning, the aircraft that had killed Captain Apt, Robert Frost, and scores of others. Pilots had given it a nickname that would make any mother's heart stop: the Widowmaker. The P-38 was fast, deadly, and beautiful. It was also a flying death trap in the hands of anyone who didn't understand its dark secret. Lieutenant Marcus Webb learned this the hard way over Normandy in January 1944. His flight of 4 P-38 seconds encountered a formation of Focke-Wulf 190 seconds at 28,000 feet. Standard engagement: dive to build speed, attack from above, climb back to altitude. Webb's 3 wingmen followed him down. Only Webb came back up. What Webb witnessed in those 30 seconds would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. As his pilots accelerated through 450 miles per hour, their aircraft began to behave identically. All 3 P-38 seconds pitched forward into steeper dives simultaneously, as if controlled by the same invisible puppeteer. Webb, who had instinctively throttled back just before the critical speed, watched helplessly as his friends hurtled past him, their aircraft shaking so violently he could see it from 200 yards away. Lieutenant Davis was the first to go. His P-38's tail section separated at 18,000 feet, the booms spinning away like propeller blades. The main fuselage, with Davis still inside, continued straight down. Lieutenant Morrison fought it longer. Webb could see him in the cockpit, silhouetted against the winter sky, pulling back on the stick with such force that his shoulders were nearly at his ears. It didn't matter. At 12,000 feet, Morrison's wings folded upward like a bird trying to take flight, then tore off completely. The fuselage tumbled end over end until it disappeared into the clouds below. Lieutenant Junior Hayes, only 19 years old, fresh from flight school, didn't even make it that far. His entire aircraft disintegrated at 15,000 feet in an explosion of aluminum and fuel that looked like a firework. Webb landed alone. When ground crews asked where his wingmen were, he couldn't speak. He just stood there, staring at his hands, which were still trembling on an invisible control stick. 3 pilots, 3 deaths, 30 seconds, and officially, enemy action. The Focke-Wulfs they'd been chasing had never even fired a shot. Back at right field, Richard Frost was working on something radical.
If they couldn't stop compressibility, and they couldn't, not without fundamentally redesigning every aircraft in the Allied inventory, maybe they could give pilots a fighting chance to survive it.
His solution was elegantly simple and terrifyingly difficult to implement: dive recovery flaps. The concept was straightforward. Install small flaps under the wings that a pilot could deploy during a high-speed dive. These flaps would disrupt the airflow just enough to reduce speed and help the pilot regain control before the aircraft tore itself apart. But there was a problem. Testing the flaps meant someone had to deliberately fly into the compressibility zone, the death zone, and try to survive it. Enter Captain Harold "Hal" Fisher, a test pilot with a reputation for being either the bravest or the craziest man at right field, depending on who you asked. On the 15th of February 1944, Fisher climbed into a modified P-38 equipped with Frost's experimental dive flaps. The plan was to dive from 35,000 feet, accelerate to 500 miles per hour well into the death zone, deploy the flaps, and attempt recovery. Richard Frost stood on the tarmac, watching through binoculars, his brother's photograph still pinned to his chest. Fisher took off at 0900 hours. By 0915, he was at altitude and beginning his dive. The radio crackled. Starting descent. Speed passing 400, 420, 440. On the ground, every engineer, every mechanic, every person who knew what was happening stood frozen, barely breathing. 464, 180. Christ, she's shaking like a leaf. 500 miles per hour. I'm in it. I can feel it. Stick's dead. Nose is pitching down. Deploying flaps now. Silence. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. Then, I've got response. Stick's coming back. She's fighting me, but she's responding. Pull out at 8,000 feet. Holy Mary, Mother of God. It worked. It worked. When Fisher landed, his flight suit was soaked through with sweat despite the freezing temperature. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't unbuckle his harness. Ground crews had to help him out of the cockpit. Richard Frost met him on the tarmac. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. "Your brother would be proud," Fisher said quietly. Frost nodded, unable to speak. They'd found a way to survive the unsurvivable. But there was a cruel irony. Producing and installing dive recovery flaps on thousands of aircraft would take months, maybe a year. And the war wasn't waiting. Pilots were still dying. Right now, today, this very hour. Something else had to be done. What happened next was never officially sanctioned, never appeared in any military document, and could have resulted in court-martials for everyone involved. Experienced pilots started warning the new guys, not in official briefings, not in training manuals, but in mess halls, in barracks, in quiet conversations before dawn missions. A whispered network of survival knowledge passed from veteran to rookie like contraband. "Listen to me, kid. You get a kraut on your tail. Don't dive straight down. You hear me? Don't trust your gut. Your gut will kill you. See this mark on the airspeed indicator? That's 450 inches of P-38, 500 inches of Thunderbolt. You cross that line in a dive, you're dead. I don't care how good you think you are. If you feel the stick go heavy, if the nose wants to pitch down on its own, you've got maybe 5 seconds. Cut throttle. Deploy flaps if you've got them. Pray." In that order. Lieutenant James Caldwell, who'd survived his own brush with compressibility over the English Channel, became one of these underground instructors. He'd gather new pilots in his quarters and draw diagrams, explain the physics in terms they could understand. "Think of it like this," he'd say. "The air becomes a wall. Your wings stop flying and start falling. The faster you go, the harder the wall, the steeper the fall. You don't fight it with strength, you can't. You fight it with knowledge." One of his students was a fresh-faced 20-year-old named Tommy Richardson from Nebraska. Richardson had arrived in England in March 1944, eager to prove himself, full of the invincibility that comes with youth. "I'm a good pilot, sir," Richardson said confidently after one of Caldwell's sessions. "I can handle a dive." Caldwell grabbed him by the shoulders and looked him dead in the eyes. "Tommy, I've watched 6 good pilots, better pilots than you, better than me, die because they thought exactly that. 6 friends, 6 funerals. Don't let your mother bury you because you were too proud to be scared." Richardson would remember those words 3 weeks later, when they saved his life. The 18th of April, 1944, somewhere over occupied France. Richardson's P-47 Thunderbolt shook as cannon fire stitched holes in his left wing. A German Bf-109 was on his tail, close enough that Richardson could see the pilot's face in his mirror. Every instinct screamed, "Dive!" His hand moved toward the stick. And then Caldwell's voice echoed in his head. "Don't trust your gut. Your gut will kill you." Instead of diving straight down, Richardson rolled inverted, pulled back gently, and descended in a spiraling arc bleeding speed intentionally, staying below that critical threshold. The Messerschmitt pilot, more experienced, more confident, didn't hesitate. He pushed his stick forward and dove straight down after the American, determined to finish the kill. Richardson watched in his mirror as the 109 accelerated to 500 miles per hour, then 520. Then 550. And then, exactly as Caldwell had described, the German fighter's nose pitched downward more steeply. The aircraft began to shudder. The pilot, Richardson, could see him clearly now, was pulling back on the stick with both hands, his face contorted with effort. It didn't matter. At 8,000 feet, the Messerschmitt's wings folded, and the aircraft disintegrated in midair. Richardson leveled out, his heart pounding, and whispered into his radio, "Caldwell, if you can hear this, thank you." The knowledge had spread. The tide was beginning to turn. But the war had one more cruel lesson to teach about the deadliest move in the sky. And it would be written in fire above the beaches of Normandy, the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day, 0530 hours. Captain James Caldwell stood on the rain-soaked tarmac at RAF Tangmere, watching the largest invasion force in human history cross the English Channel in the pre-dawn darkness. Hundreds of transport aircraft, thousands of paratroopers, all heading toward the beaches of Normandy. And above them, providing air cover, were pilots who'd listened to his warnings. Pilots who knew the invisible killer in the sky was just as dangerous as the German fighters they'd face. What none of them knew, what even Caldwell couldn't have predicted, was that D-Day would become the single deadliest day for compressibility-related deaths in the entire war. Not because pilots forgot their training, but because the chaos of battle would force them to make an impossible choice: die by enemy fire or risk death by physics. The skies over Normandy that morning were a madhouse. German fighters dove through gaps in the clouds, attacking the vulnerable transport planes. Allied fighters scrambled to intercept, twisting and turning at altitudes ranging from 20,000 feet to just above the wave tops. And in that chaos, the unthinkable kept happening. Pilots, with no other option, found themselves forced into vertical dives at speeds they knew were lethal. Lieutenant Tommy Richardson, the young pilot Caldwell had mentored, was flying top cover over Omaha Beach when his squadron encountered a formation of Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, attacking a group of C-47 transports carrying paratroopers. "Break! Break! 6 bandits! 12 o'clock high!" his squadron leader shouted. The Focke-Wulfs had the altitude advantage, diving down at over 400 miles per hour, their cannons already firing. The C-47 seconds slow, unarmed, packed with human beings, were sitting ducks. Richardson had to make a choice: let the transports die, or intercept the attackers using the only tactic that would work: a high-speed dive from above. He chose the transports. "Blue 3 diving," Richardson shouted into his radio, pushing his P-47 into a near-vertical descent. His airspeed indicator spun like a clock gone mad. 350, 400, 450. Caldwell's voice echoed in his head. "That's 500 inches a thunderbolt. You cross that line in a dive, you're dead." 480 miles per hour. The stick was getting heavy in his hands. The nose was starting to pitch downward on its own. 490 miles per hour. He could see the lead Focke-Wulf in his gun sight now, growing larger. The German pilot completely unaware of the American plummeting toward him like a meteor. 495 miles per hour. The aircraft was shaking. His vision was starting to gray at the edges from the G-forces. And then Richardson did something that would later be studied in every aviation school in the world. Instead of firing and continuing the dive, which would have pushed him past the death threshold, he fired a 1-second burst, pulled his throttle to idle, deployed his flaps, and began a shallow pullout, sacrificing the kill for survival. His burst missed the Focke-Wulf by inches, but the sudden appearance of tracers spooked the German formation. They broke off their attack on the transports and scattered. Richardson leveled out at 10,000 feet, his hands shaking, his flight suit drenched in sweat. In those C-47 seconds, 63 paratroopers lived to jump over Normandy because one pilot remembered that survival mattered more than glory. But not everyone made the same choice. 20 miles east, Captain Michael Irish O'Connor wasn't so lucky. O'Connor was a legend: 17 confirmed kills, a distinguished flying cross, and a reputation for aggressive, fearless flying. He was the kind of pilot younger men wanted to be, the kind commanders pointed to as an example of American fighting spirit. When O'Connor's flight encountered German bombers attacking the invasion fleet, he didn't hesitate. 6 Junkers Ju-88 bombers, escorted by fighters, were making a run toward the ships packed with soldiers waiting to storm the beaches. "All units, this is Irish One. We're going through them. Follow me down." O'Connor rolled his P-51 Mustang inverted and dove, his wingmen following in perfect formation. What O'Connor didn't account for, what he couldn't account for in the heat of battle, was that his Mustang had taken flak damage earlier that morning. Nothing serious, just a few holes in the wing. The ground crew had cleared him for flight. But those holes changed everything. As O'Connor accelerated past 500 miles per hour, the damaged wing began to flutter differently than the undamaged one. The asymmetric airflow created a roll moment that compounded with the compressibility effects. His wingman, Lieutenant Robert Chen, watched in horror as O'Connor's Mustang began to roll inverted while still diving vertically. O'Connor fought it, trying to use his ailerons to level the wings, but at that speed, in the compressibility zone, the control surfaces were almost useless. "Irish one, you're rolling! Pull out! Pull out!" Chen screamed into his radio. O'Connor's voice came back, eerily calm. "Can't, Bobby. She won't respond. Tell my wife. Tell her it was quick." At 6,000 feet, still inverted, still diving, Captain Michael O'Connor stopped fighting. Chen saw him raise one hand in a final salute. The P-51 Mustang impacted the English Channel at over 600 miles per hour, creating a waterspout that was visible from the beaches. The impact was so violent that not a single piece of wreckage larger than a dinner plate was ever recovered. 17 confirmed kills, distinguished Flying Cross, dead at 26 because of a few flak holes and the immutable laws of physics. The German bombers O'Connor had dove to intercept completed their run, damaging 2 landing craft and killing 14 soldiers. His sacrifice hadn't saved them. By noon on D-Day, Allied Air Command was receiving disturbing reports. Of the 43 Allied aircraft lost that morning, 17 were listed as unknown cause or mechanical failure, the euphemisms for compressibility deaths. 17 pilots, in one morning, on the most important day of the war. In a cramped operations room in England, Richard Frost stood before a map studded with pins marking each loss. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight. "How many more?" he said quietly. "How many more have to die before we ground every aircraft that doesn't have dive recovery flaps?" A colonel looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Ground the fleet? Today? Are you insane? We'd lose air superiority. The invasion would fail. We're losing pilots to our own aircraft." "We're losing pilots to a lot of things today, Mr. Frost. That's what war is." It was the brutal calculus of command. Individual lives versus strategic objectives. And today, strategy won. But something changed in that moment. The Air Force brass, seeing the casualty reports, seeing the pattern, finally made a decision that would save countless lives. Emergency orders went out that afternoon to every fighter squadron in England. Mandatory briefings on compressibility. No exceptions. Immediate implementation. For the first time, pilots would be officially told what Caldwell and others had been whispering in barracks for months. They'd be shown the speeds, the symptoms, the survival techniques. The cover-up was over, not because command suddenly cared more about individual lives, but because they'd done the math. Trained pilots were more valuable than the secrecy. That night, after the longest day in aviation history, James Caldwell found himself in the officers' club, nursing a whiskey he wasn't really drinking. Tommy Richardson found him there. "You saved my life today, sir," Richardson said quietly. "Your warning. I remembered everything you said." Caldwell nodded but didn't look up from his glass. "How many others?" Richardson asked. "How many others did you save with those late-night briefings?" "I don't know," Caldwell said. His voice was hollow. "But I know how many I didn't save. I know their names. I know their faces. I dream about them." Richardson sat down next to him. "Michael O'Connor died today," Caldwell continued. "Irish. You know what his last words were? 'Tell my wife it was quick.' He knew he was dead, and he wanted his wife to think it didn't hurt." Caldwell finally looked at Richardson, and the young pilot was startled to see tears in his eyes. "We're asking boys, and that's what you are, Tommy. Boys to fight an enemy that shoots back, in machines that can kill them if they fly wrong. Following orders from men who knew the machines could kill them and didn't warn them until today. But they're warning them now," Richardson said. "Because of what you did. Because you refused to stay quiet. Tommy, I watched 6 friends die. 6. Do you understand? 6 coffins. 6 folded flags, 6 letters home. And now, O'Connor makes 7. Richardson didn't know what to say. He just sat there, a 20-year-old kid from Nebraska who'd survived his first real combat by remembering lessons whispered to him by a man who'd watched his friends turn into statistics. Finally, Caldwell drained his whiskey. "Promise me something, kid. You survive this war, you become a flight instructor, you make damn sure every pilot who ever sits in a cockpit knows what we learned in blood. You make sure this never happens again." Richardson nodded. "I promise, sir." He would keep that promise. After the war, Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Richardson would write the definitive training manual on high-speed aerodynamics and compressibility effects, a manual that would be used to train fighter pilots for the next 3 decades. But that was years away. Tonight, on D-Day, as soldiers fought and died on the beaches below, another battle was being fought in the sky, not just against the Germans, but against the invisible enemy that had killed more pilots than anyone would ever officially acknowledge. What the Allies didn't know what wouldn't be discovered until after the war, when intelligence officers examined captured Luftwaffe documents, was that the Germans had been dealing with the same problem. And they'd been dealing with it for longer. In 1941, 2 years before the Allies even identified compressibility as a systemic problem, German test pilot Heini Dittmar had deliberately flown a Messerschmitt Me-163 rocket plane into a near supersonic dive, reaching speeds of 623 miles per hour. He survived. Barely. His aircraft was nearly torn apart. He suffered a spinal compression injury from the G-forces, and his report to Luftwaffe Command was clear. Beyond a certain speed, aircraft became uncontrollable. The Germans had responded by implementing strict dive speed limits, mandatory training, and eventually design modifications to their fighter aircraft. By 1944, while Allied pilots were still dying from compressibility in significant numbers, German losses to the phenomenon had dropped to almost 0. But in the chaos and secrecy of war, this knowledge never crossed the battle lines. Allied and Axis pilots died of the same cause, discovered the same solutions independently, and never knew that on the other side of the conflict, their enemies were fighting the exact same invisible killer. War, it turned out, didn't just kill people. It killed information. And when information died, more people followed. August 1945. The war was over, but the killing wasn't. On a cloudless morning over the Mojave Desert, test pilot Major Richard Bong, America's top ace, with 40 confirmed kills. A man who'd survived 4 years of combat in the Pacific climbed into the cockpit of a new P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter. He took off at 0915 hours. At 0923, his aircraft plummeted into the desert at 500 miles per hour and exploded. The war had ended. Compressibility hadn't. When military historians finally tallied the numbers after the war, the truth was staggering. Between 1,943 and 1,945 compressibility-related incidents had killed an estimated 300 to 500 Allied pilots, more than were lost in some entire air campaigns. The P-38 Lightning alone accounted for over 120 deaths, earning its nickname, the Widowmaker, in blood. But here's what haunted Richard Frost, the engineer who'd lost his brother and spent the war fighting to save pilots. Most of those deaths occurred before mandatory compressibility training was implemented on D-Day. After the 6th of June 1944, when pilots were finally officially warned about the danger, deaths dropped by 70% almost immediately. 70%. That meant that for every 10 pilots who died before D-Day, 7 could have been saved with nothing more than information. No new technology, no redesigned aircraft, just knowledge. James Caldwell, now a major, stood in Frost's office in late 1945, looking at the final casualty reports. "We could have saved them," Caldwell said quietly. "All of them. Just by telling the truth." Frost nodded. His brother's photograph still on his desk. The deadliest move in the sky wasn't diving. It was silence. But the story doesn't end with the war. Because compressibility wasn't solved, it was only understood. And as aircraft got faster, approaching and then exceeding the speed of sound, the phenomenon evolved into something even more dangerous. The 14th of October, 1947, Edwards Air Force Base. Captain Chuck Yeager climbed into the Bell X-1, a rocket plane designed to do what everyone said was impossible: break the sound barrier. Yeager had been briefed on every pilot who died trying. He knew about Mel Apt, about Captain Bong, about the hundreds of others who'd pushed too fast and paid the ultimate price. "You know what they're calling Mach 1? His flight engineer said as they sealed the cockpit. "The death line. Nobody's ever crossed it and lived." Yeager grinned. "Then I guess it's time somebody did." At 45,000 feet, the X-1 dropped from its mothership, and Yeager ignited the rockets. The aircraft accelerated like nothing had ever accelerated before. Mach 0.85, 0.9, 0.95. The buffeting started. The controls went stiff. The aircraft began to shake violently. All the symptoms that had killed so many pilots. But Yeager had something they didn't: knowledge earned through their sacrifice. He knew exactly what to expect. He'd trained for this moment using lessons written in the blood of hundreds of test pilots and combat aviators. Mach 0.98, 0.99, and then, at Mach 1.02, something miraculous happened. The shaking stopped. The controls loosened. The aircraft flew smooth as glass. Yeager had broken through the sound barrier through the death zone and emerged on the other side into what pilots would come to call the supersonic realm. When he landed and climbed out of the X-1, Yeager was mobbed by engineers and pilots. Richard Frost was there, tears streaming down his face. "You did it," Frost said. "You survived what killed my brother." Yeager shook his head. "No, sir. Your brother and all those other pilots, they're the ones who did it. I just finished what they started." Tommy Richardson kept his promise. He became a flight instructor and later a colonel in the newly formed U.S. Air Force. His training manual, High-Speed Aerodynamics and Pilot Survival, became required reading for every fighter pilot in America. In the introduction, he wrote, "This manual is dedicated to the hundreds of pilots who died discovering the information contained within these pages. They paid for this knowledge with their lives so that you wouldn't have to. Honor their sacrifice by learning these lessons well." James Caldwell retired from the Air Force in 1960 as a brigadier general. He spent his retirement visiting flight schools, telling the story of the invisible killer in the sky, making sure new generations understood that speed without knowledge was just another way to die. He lived to see the era of supersonic fighters, of jets that routinely flew at speeds that would have been unimaginable in 1943. Every one of them incorporated design, features, and training protocols developed from those deadly wartime lessons. Richard Frost never designed another aircraft. After the war, he became a safety inspector, dedicating his life to making sure that engineering shortcuts never again cost pilots their lives. His brother's photograph never left his desk, and on the wall of every major flight school in the world, there's a plaque. The words vary slightly from place to place, but the message is always the same. In memory of the pilots who discovered that the sky has limits, and that ignorance of those limits is more deadly than any enemy. In 1998, James Caldwell died at age 77. His funeral was attended by over 300 pilots, men and women who'd never met him, but who'd read his name in their training manuals, who'd learned the lessons he'd fought to teach. Tommy Richardson, now 74 years old, delivered the eulogy. "Jim Caldwell saved my life in 1944, Richardson said, his voice steady despite his tears. "But he didn't just save me. He saved hundreds, maybe thousands of pilots by refusing to stay silent when silence was easier. He taught us that the most dangerous enemy isn't always the one shooting at you. Sometimes it's the one you can't see, and the people who know about it but won't tell you." He paused, looking at the flag-draped coffin. The deadliest move in the sky became the deadliest move because nobody warned us. And it stopped being deadly when somebody finally did. That somebody was Jim Caldwell. The funeral ended with a missing man formation 4 F-16. Fighting Falcons screaming overhead, one pulling up and away, leaving an empty space in the sky. Those jets flew at speeds that would have torn a P-38 apart. They flew safely because hundreds of pilots hadn't. And never let silence be the cause of death again.